Hello. Welcome to my backyard. I've been having fun making videos about the new X-H2s, and I thought that it would be fun to do an autofocus test. I've been using the X-H2s a lot more for filming myself. It's great to use autofocus in those situations because setting it up with manual focus is kind of a pain and it doesn't allow you as much flexibility to move around. I have a Fringer EF-FX Pro II adapter for my Sigma art lenses, which have EF mount. I've got the Sigma 18-35, the Sigma 24-70, and then I also have some Fuji glass. This is the lens that I use a lot for video on Fuji. It's the XF 16-55 2.8 lens, which really feels like a 24-70 on the APS-C sensor. The focus ring on this for manual focus is terrible to use. It's like electronic, so it doesn't really feel that great, but the autofocus is super smooth and super sharp on this lens. So I thought this was a really good lens to test for that. The wildcard lens, I have the Fuji 23mm f1.4 lens. If I set it to 1.4, it's really gonna show issues if there are any, and to really see what it's doing. Normally I would use like a variable ND or an ND filter on the front of the lens, but for this test, I'm not gonna use any ND. I don't wanna put anything in front of it that could affect it. Yeah, so let's get started. All right, so I'm on continuous autofocus. AF mode, I'm gonna do it to area. My tracking sensitivity, I'm gonna set it to 2 to be kind of an in-between, because if I move, I don't want it to search. So I'm gonna leave my AF speed at 0 to be kind of an in-between. If you put it down, if you're doing shots where you're kind of racking focus, it'll go slower. And on fast, if you're racking focus, it'll kind of jump back and forth. Face eye detection, I'm gonna do on, and then eye auto. We're on the X-H2s. I'm shooting in f-log 2. And then I have the Sigma 18-35. I feel like this is a pretty common setup. This is one of my favorite lenses to shoot with. It is detecting it on my eye. It actually is tracking pretty well. And walk back in. The autofocus on this lens, for some reason the lens itself is a little bit clicky when it focuses. It sounds jittery, and I'm not sure what that actually looks like on camera when it's like rack focusing. But when you're using it just from a user perspective, it's not the greatest sound to hear. I don't love it. I definitely prefer like a silent lens because it just sounds like something is wrong. So that's one thing to note if you're using this lens with autofocus. Now we're gonna test walking up. Let's see how it tracks me. Walking up, walking up. I'm tapping on the screen where I want it to focus. So pulling in, tapping, there it goes. So I'm just filming all of this in autofocus, not changing anything, not tapping on the screen at all. For some reason, when I'm changing the sensitivity settings, it doesn't feel like it's really doing anything with this lens. I'm not sure if it's like a communication thing or not. Like if you're trying to do a rack focus, trying to touch one part and then focus into another part, it's either really laggy and doesn't feel very responsive, or it just shoots back and forth really fast. Anytime I just filmed like something straight on where it wasn't pulling focus, it just had to make it sharp. Those shots, it felt a lot better and it felt like it got it. But anytime I threw a more complicated shot at it, it definitely felt like it was struggling with this lens. All right. Now we are using the Fuji XF 16-55 f2.8 lens. This is native Fuji glass, so I'm curious to see if it has any difference on the autofocus quality. Right off the bat, I noticed that it's not making any sort of like clicking sound, which I really like. I can see on the screen that it's right straight on my eye, which is really nice. And right now this is 16 millimeters. And then if I go in, this is 55. And there's my eyes struggling a little bit. If you're pulling focus yourself, you don't follow people perfectly anyways. So I feel like to make it feel like someone is actually operating the camera, having it be a little bit slower and being okay with it going out of focus for a second or two, I think that's fine with me. I don't need it to be like tack sharp on my eye all the time, no matter where I go. Because I feel like that also, like if you look at the background, when I move in and out like that, it can be kind of distracting if you look at the background to see it going like in and out like crazy. So adjusting the speed to be slower, I think is definitely a good thing to do. It all depends on what you're filming though. So I think those settings are more of a like user preference thing. Let's see if I go back. This is at 55 and walking in. So that's at 55 and then 16. Let's put it at, this is at 23. So that's pretty good. Yeah, it feels pretty responsive. I have the autofocus settings. Let me see. So I have this set to multi, AFC, and I'm at +3 and -4. So I slowed down the speed because I felt like it was just going crazy. And then the sensitivity, I set it to be more locked on. This is walking in. Let's see how close I can get. All right, this time I'm set to 0 and 0, so just the default settings. All right, so this is at 0 and then -2, so a little bit slower, but same responsiveness. I feel like this is probably the speed that I would likely pull focus myself if I was doing that. So I'm setting it to area now. So I'm just tapping on the screen, which is kind of cool, to tell it where to focus. So I'm not moving. This requires a little bit more work of the user, but you can do things where I can like preemptively be on that and then tap. So I'm not leaving it up to the camera as much. You might need to adjust the speed to your liking, but I feel like this mode gives you a little more control. Vlogging test. This is the, see how well it follows. I go through different lighting. Yeah, I feel like it definitely does a pretty good job. It's on my eye. Definitely hasn't come off. If I look away, and I'm at 2.8 right now, feels like it does a decent job, and it's a nice looking lens. So I would definitely recommend this combo. Stays pretty locked on. So let's go into the garage. Low light, still has my eye, which is kind of crazy. I mean, this is kind of a hard scenario, but it's not terrible, but it's not incredible. All right, so in my opinion, the Fuji XF 16-55 2.8 is probably one of the best lenses that you can get if you want to really rely on autofocus. Since it's native Fuji glass, it communicates with the camera perfectly. It doesn't have to go through an adapter. Plus, it has a great focal range. 16-55 is basically like a 24-70 on a full frame camera. It is a bigger lens, but I love the constant aperture. So shooting video, if I'm zooming in and out, or you know, anytime I zoom, I don't have to change the exposure. So I would highly recommend this lens. It's a big upgrade from the kit lens, and with the X-H2s, having IBIS inside the body, you don't really need the IBIS in the lens as much. However, there definitely is space for the IBIS in this camera to improve. I don't love it, I don't hate it, but it could definitely be better. All right, so this is our wild card lens. This is the Fuji XF 23mm f1.4 lens, and I have it set all the way at f1.4. I have it on face tracking with the same settings as before of the speed. And this lens is kind of noisy. It's like click, 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 click. I feel like it is struggling a little bit more. I can see like it was on my mouth for a second, but you know, this lens being 1.4, it is really nice looking in the background if you want to shoot wide open. Walk up to the camera. So yeah, I don't know. Might not be the most reliable option. I will say too that the motor in this lens is obnoxiously loud. Like right now, it doesn't bug me a whole lot when I'm filming myself on a tripod, but if I'm using autofocus, like shooting B-roll and holding the camera in my hands, it's like constantly, it just feels terrible. And compared to the XF 16-55 2.8, that lens, you can't even feel anything when it's moving. So it just feels smooth, it feels good. This lens looks nice, but it might not be worth it. If I had to choose between this lens and shooting with the Sigma 18-35 1.8, I might sacrifice some of the autofocus performance just to be able to use that lens that's a little bit quieter, a little bit nicer to use. Now we're doing a vlogging test on the 23mm 1.4 lens. It's definitely a little bit too tight for vlogging. Like my arm is all the way extended. It's lighter though than the 16-55, which is nice. But yeah, I feel like just in general with the Fuji glass, obviously since it's communicating and it's made by Fuji, there's something in it that makes it a lot better for autofocus than if you're going through the adapter. I haven't tested other adapters. Fringer is definitely the best brand to go with for Fuji adapters. They're more on the expensive side, but I used to have a Viltrox adapter and I basically never used it because it was so bad. So the Fringer is a lot better than the Viltrox. So just in case you were wondering. All right, now we are on the Sigma 24-70 art lens f2.8 with the Fringer adapter. This lens is so beefy. I love it. This lens is the best. I use it on full frame cameras and it just looks incredible. It also has image stabilization built in. So using this lens with the X-H2s, with the OIS, the IBIS, they kind of like cancel each other out. You get a really nice smooth image. This lens is definitely newer than the 18-35. So I'm curious to see if it makes that clicking sound again. But it seems like it's following me pretty well. Move out of frame. Definitely feels like it hunted a little bit there. All right, so I'm at +2 and -4 now. So a little bit slower speed and it stays a little bit more locked on. Yeah, so I'm holding it in my hands now and it definitely is making a clicking sound. And I'm wanting it to focus on this foreground plant, but it's not going. All right, so I'm at 35 now on this lens, f2.8. There we go. Definitely doesn't feel like feels like it goes past and then it's thinking. Yeah, it just feels really slow. So it is like relatively smooth. It just doesn't feel incredibly responsive. Like I'm tapping on the fence now and it's not going anywhere. And this is at 24mm AFC vlogging test. This lens is so heavy. I would not use this to vlog at all, but I don't think I would trust it either, so. All right, so I'm back in the edit bay and I had a chance to watch over the footage and see it on a big screen. So in conclusion, overall, would I trust and use the X-H2s autofocus? Yes, I definitely would. In most scenarios, it's actually really good, and I'm really pleased with how it works, especially compared to past Fuji cameras. The one thing I'll say is that if I'm using native Fuji glass, I trust it way more than if I'm using my adapter with the Sigma lenses. From my testing, the XF 16-55 2.8 was by far the best lens to use with autofocus for video. The lens was completely silent. It was able to track myself and other subjects really well. It worked really well with the AFC custom settings, doing rack focuses in area mode by tapping on the screen. And it even did a really good job at tracking me at 55 millimeters. So overall, that lens was a really nice one to use. I did notice that in the AFC custom settings, I was setting my autofocus speed to be a little bit slower, like -3 or -4. I felt like that looked more organic than the other settings. And then I was setting the AF tracking to like +2 or +3, which means that it stays locked onto the subject better. So if something like goes out, it doesn't just like automatically start looking for another object. It stayed tracked on. AF multi felt like it was searching more for the subject. And it doesn't really show you anything on the screen for AF multi if there's no face in the screen. It just kind of like does whatever it wants. And then AF area is nice, but it kind of requires you to be on the joystick a little bit more, like showing it where you want it to focus. But I did notice that once it did focus on the area, it stayed on that area pretty well. And then if there's a face in the image too, it definitely tracks that really well. So mostly I would probably stay on AF area and just set it to really the middle of the frame, and then use the eye tracking and set it to auto, and that seems to be a good balance. Compared to Sony, I would say that it's still a little bit behind, but it is much closer than it was before. It's a little less accurate, and it's still missing the really nice features that Sony has, like object tracking and being able to see what the camera is doing on the screen when it's in autofocus. For me, when it comes down to it, it's kind of a trade-off, because if I want good autofocus, I have to use native Fuji lenses, and those aren't always my first choice for shooting video. I would much rather use my Sigma art lenses or something else with a little bit more character. But that means I have to use an adapter, and it means that I'm sacrificing some of the AF quality. So I have to decide if I want a better image, if I want better autofocus, or if I just want to scrap it all and shoot in manual focus mode and just not care about it. I think if you find a balance between autofocus and manual focus and figure out when to use each of them, you're gonna get some great results. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.